It's my great pleasure to introduce Chiara Thumiger, who is a Wellcome Research Fellow at the University of Warwick. Chiara has published extensively on ancient medicine, psychology, and disability, and her current research focuses on the history of rhinitis, including its developments in Western medicine. Chiara will talk to us about the therapy of the word in ancient Greek medicine. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thanks again to Sophia and to the other organizers for inviting me to this conference. It is really a great topic and a perfect combination of interdisciplinary approaches, so it's really great to be here. My area of research is ancient medicine, and more in the specific ancient ideas about mental health and mental disorder from the time of the Hippocratic texts, that is from the classical era, 5th, 4th century BCE, to the late antique period. Now, what I would like to do today is offer an overview of a development in ancient history of psychology and medicine in this very long time range by focusing on therapy, on the idea of a curability of mental disturbance, and on one particular branch of therapeutics that I have labeled therapies of the word. I want to look at the extent to which measures, other than standard repertoire of medical treatments in ancient medicine, were used. And by standard, I mean dietetics, so including food, sleep, drink, sex, exercise, so everything that has to do with the regime, everyday life, or pharmacological methods. So everything that doesn't have to do with these basic physiological approaches. Now, to indicate this alternative to the strictly physiological, I have used the expression therapies of the word, although this label somehow is restricted in its range, as you will see. The group of therapies that I want to discuss includes, in fact, not only various forms of talking and verbal communication, but also occupational aspects, such as travels or activities of various kinds, distractions of the mind, emotional and artistic diversions. In general, all those therapies and medical prescriptions which show an attention for the personal, the private sphere, as specifically relevant to a category of diseases recognized as mental. This may be something we take for granted, but if one is familiar a bit with what happens in the Hippocratic texts, such an approach was not really the rule in ancient medicine at its beginnings. Now, it is of course a well-known fact that spoken words, speech, hearing, the verbalized thought of others, communication through discourse, are a particularly celebrated feature in Greek culture from its very beginning. And not only in a general sense, but also with a precise awareness of the impact words can have on the well-being of speakers and listeners, what we call, and also Greek physicians later will call, their health, not only their well-being in a general sense. Take as first example, very general example, that passage, this passage from the Odyssey, the famous passage in Book 8, when Odysseus has just reached the Phaeacians' island and is eager to finally be able to return home. The king of the island, Alcinous, has received him and has organized a banquet for the guest. During the feast, the singer Demodocus begins to sing the story of the fall of Troy, a story Odysseus knows very well, and of course in first person. He is distressed by what he hears and begins to cry in silence with a deep wailing, barou-stenachon is the term used by Homer, that escapes the notice of most, but not of the king. So Alcinous understands the mood of his guest and speaks as follows. He speaks to the other people present there and says, "Hear me, leaders and counselors of the Phaeacians. And let Demodocus now check his clear-toned lyre, for his song is not entirely pleasing to all alike. Ever since we began to eat and the divine singer was moved to sing, from that time the stranger has never ceased from sorrow and lamentation. Grief, I think, has encompassed his heart." So first of all, the painful words have to stop. And then Odysseus is invited to tell his own story, a long account that will continue from Book 5 into Book 12. Therefore, he says, Alcinous says, "You too do not longer hide with crafty thought whatever I shall ask you. To speak out plainly is the better course. Tell me the name by which they called you in your home, your mother and your father and the other people who lived around." And then Odysseus begins by telling his own story. So this turning point in the poem is not only important as a narrative expedient, as an element in the structure of the poem, which is famous in this respect, but also for how it illustrates a deep grief kept inside by Odysseus for a long time and whose outburst is triggered by words, and a healing also carried out, at least in part, through words. When Odysseus finishes his story, 6 books later, the audience, I quote, remains still in silence as taken by a spell in the shady hall. Words are recognized to have a soothing, almost magical power, a power to hurt but also to heal. Of course, the Homeric poems are no medical text, and this episode is not really about a disease or a disorder. It's about the pacifying effect of words heard or spoken to friends in moments of suffering, or talking and communication in a general sense. Odysseus is not sick, he's only deeply distressed. But it is important to see what psychological, emotional power is assigned to words from early on in Greek culture. A second non-medical reference from the classical period this time comes from a comedy by Aristophanes, the WASPS. And here instead, it is apparent that words are tried as a possible cure for a mental patient in the specific. The main character of this play, Philocleon, is obsessed with trials and law courts. Famously, his appears to be a desperate case, and his son Delicleon has tried everything but in vain to cure him. At first, he tried him with gentleness, wanted to persuade him to wear the cloak no longer, to go out no more. Unable to convince him, he had him bathed and purified according to the ritual without success. Then he takes him to Aegina and forcibly makes him lie one night in the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. But again, this doesn't work. So in the end, the only opportunity he has left is to try and lock him up at home, but this also doesn't work. So these are just 2 disconnected examples. One could go further, exploring the motif of enchantment through words, a central theme in classical thought, from Gorgias' encomium to Helen, to Plato's discussion of poetry and other topics we have already talked about today in the last panel. Or turning to the many places in tragedy in which suffering and heightened mental states are addressed through words. These sources have been scrutinized much more in this respect than the medical texts, and we will hear about tragedy tomorrow, in particular in Sophie Mill's paper. What I wanted to do by beginning with Homer and Aristophanes is just show how the idea that words, communication, and verbal exchange can impact on one's well-being and even health, especially mental, is traditional in wider Greek culture. To an extent, we can read what is going on in these 2 scenes or anecdotes I have showed you as forms of psychotherapy, or attempts at least, variously successful. The classical audiences understood, we are allowed to believe, pretty much the way we do. But what about medicine? In medicine, therapies of the word, even if you extend the label to include not only talk, but any other therapy which might belong to a psychotherapeutical horizon, become part of medical discussions and medical therapy only late. Indeed, such practices are conspicuous for their absence in earlier medicine. It is useful for those who are not familiar to history of ancient medicine in particular to look for a moment at a broad chronology for this tradition. Now, when I say earlier medicine or classical medicine, I mean the writings of the Hippocratic corpus, and more generally one should say those writings that belong to the 5th, 4th century BCE. Most of them constitute the main bulk of the Hippocratic corpus, which also includes later stuff as well. Then Hellenistic medicine are those sources that belong to the 3rd to the 1st century BCE, and they are only survive mostly in fragmentary form, and they don't have so much to tell us about psychology, unfortunately, in a direct sources that we have. So most of the material we're going to look at today come from the later period, the late antique period, or the 1st centuries of our era, starting from the the Roman author Celsus to the different nosological authors, Areteus, Anonymus, Parisinus, CAELIUS, Aurelianus, and of course Galen as well. So if we consider the Hippocratic corpus, classical medicine, the 5th century BCE, we do not find anything of this kind, anything comparable to what we have discussed about Aristophanes and so on. The impression is that the medicine of this period has a project almost that precisely wants to exclude from its domain aspects that have to do with the emotions, with subjectivity, with the ethical and the private. In short, whatever belongs to the personal sphere. In the whole Hippocratic corpus, with its hundreds of patient cases, we find hardly any comment about the psychosocial context as relevant to the health or the healing of an individual. There is only one example that confirms the rule, perhaps an exception, that goes in our direction from the earlier period, which is noteworthy because it is unique. This example comes from a text that contains many philosophical suggestions and has often an obscure style, and it's of difficult interpretation. So it does not really represent the doctrine or the doctrines found in the Hippocratic texts or the clinics or the nosology of these texts. And this is the treatise on Regimen, a treatise that belongs to the Hippocratic text and discusses the kind of diet or regimen that one should follow to preserve health. The author also offers various prescriptions about the health of the soul, and among these he says that natural exercises, and I read the first passage, natural exercises are those of sight, hearing, voice, and thought. By all the thoughts that count to a man, the soul is warmed and dried. Consuming the moisture, it is exercised. It empties the flesh, and it makes a man thin. Exercise of the voice, whether speech, reading, or singing, all these move the soul. And the second, whenever the heavenly bodies, here he talks about dreams, wander about in one way or another, it indicates a disturbance of the soul arising from anxiety. Rest is beneficial in such a case. The soul should be turned to the contemplation of comic things, if possible, if not, to such other things as will bring most pleasure when looked at, for 2 or 3 days, and recovery will take place. So words heard and spoken have a strong power. They can move the soul, and they can affect the body too. Not only words spoken and heard, but also other activities, other kinds of entertainment or contemplation of particular spectacles can have an effect on the health of the soul and of the body as well. Like I said, this example is isolated within the medicine of its time and possibly reflects stronger relationships to philosophical reflections. We should then concentrate to explore the medical approach to psychotherapies on the later authors that I mentioned, those from the late antique period. The first information about psychotherapeutical moves available to us is found after the Hellenistic period, and our first text, and also one of the richest, is Celsus de Medicina. This text belongs to around the 1st century of our era and is part of an encyclopedia which was not exclusively medical in content. We don't know much about this author, but it seems evident from what he writes about medicine that he has some specific competence in this field. First of all, in his treatise, Celsus preserved to us the first medical classification of mental disorders in Book 3, where he offers a definition of insania divided into 3 types, 3 genera insaniae. And also, very interestingly, he emphasizes the lack of localization or the delocalization of insania as opposed to other diseases, for example, fevers that he just has discussed in the chapter before, and other physiological illnesses. So he really removes mental disorder away from a localization in the body. And then he discusses the 3 types of insania, the 3, well, a first kind of taxonomy, very general, of mental disorder. The first type is phrenitis, that he calls phrenesis, and is an ancient disease localized in the chest or in the head that is preeminently mental, characterized by fever. It's acute and very often mortal. This is the first type. Then follows a longer kind of insania, which he calls tristitia, and corresponds to the Greek melancholy, a longer type. And then finally there is a longissimum genus, possibly mania, that it corresponds to mania in his descriptions, that is characterized by more heightened reactions and in general a more aggressive and intense kind of mental manifestation. He expands especially on the first one, on phrenitis, and discusses it as if it were a kind of paradigmatical mental disease, whose manifestations and therapies can be applied to mental disorder more generally. What is especially useful for us is the long discussion he offers about therapy, which is a total novelty if we compare it to earlier medicine, where specific therapeutics of mental disorder as such of any kind are not found. So like his predecessors, of course, Celsus discusses also elements of diet as well as pharmacological. But what stands out is his discussion of, first of all, individual patients, and the importance of tailoring the therapy to the nature or inclination of the individual patient, the importance, the role played by talk, a kind of cognitive therapy, we will look at it in more detail, social, the incorporation of social aspects, and the use of a kind of psychodrama to, to help the patient overcome his hallucinations or strong emotions. So the text, I'll just read most of this because it's representative of what we are going to see later. In dealing with the spirits of all patients suffering from this type of insanity, it is necessary to proceed according to the nature of each case. Some need to have empty fears relieved, as was done by a wealthy man in dread of starvation to whom pretend legacies were from time to time announced. Others need to have their violence restrained, as is done in the case of those who are controlled even by flogging. In some also untimely laughter has to be put a stop to by reproof and threats. In others, melancholy thoughts are to be dissipated, for which purpose music, symbols, and noises are of use. More often, however, the patient is to be agreed with rather than opposed, and his mind slowly and imperceptibly to be turned from the rational talk to something better. At times, also, his interest should be awakened, as may be done in the case of men fond of literature, to whom a book may be read, correctly when they are pleased by it, or incorrectly if that very thing annoys them, for by making corrections they begin to divert their mind. Moreover, they should be pressed to recite anything they can remember. Some who did not want to eat were induced to do so by being placed on couches between other diners. But certainly for all so affected, sleep is both difficult and especially necessary, for under it many get well. So these approaches, these ideas, and also the level of detail he goes into to describe the kind of possible expedients that can be used to distract the obsessive thoughts of these patients, or also to kind of challenge and foster their intellectual capacities, sound really extraordinary if you compare it with the earlier sources, with what we have in the Hippocratic texts, which have so much to say about mental disorder, but never really engage with any of this stuff. They must, however, have been widespread at the time of Celsus, because not for sure it's his original development, as all other authors of the imperial age incorporate very similar measures into their nosological discussions when it comes to mental disorder. Another example is Anonymous Parisinus, a nosological text that is a text that lists different diseases, usually a capite ad calcem, talking about the different tradition about them, the etiology, and the therapy. So this nosological author also discusses phrenitis, this representative major mental disease. And first of all, he writes that patients have to be, again, to receive treatment in accordance to their inclination. First of all, they let the patient lie in a bright place, he writes. For most of them, this is a good procedure. However, choose an appropriate milieu for those who are bothered by light. For some of them, you should also adopt the light of a lamp. So it is very important to respect the different inclination of patients of this kind. During delirious fantasies, we shall calm them with the help of words, persuading them that those present are not enemies but friends, and sometimes we shall rebuke them. We shall sometimes gratify some, then we shall surreptitiously suggest a fact that they do not know, and we shall introduce to some of them their children for the purpose of comforting them, to others their wives, and if they are fond of someone, this person could be helpful at the right moment, putting all hope of calm in this. He emphasizes the modulation, again, depending from one person to the other, and also the importance of words, the use of fictional situations to bring pleasure or challenge the mind, and also the social aspect. Elsewhere, in his account of melancholy, Anonymous Parisinus also lists activities and diversions that might benefit patients. After the dietetics and pharmacological treatment, adopt long voyages and thermal waters, warm seawater, and vocal exercises again. Let us employ also the help of words which exhort them, according to this type of attack, not to surrender to the causes producing the affection, but to fight them. During the remission, let them try to enjoy the pleasures of the eyes and the ears, again, some sort of spectacles. Loves, too, should be obtained in these cases. Excite them to sex, but have them enjoy it at longer intervals. So apart from baths and pharmacological measures, the usual, there is trips, entertainment, even sex, and the social aspect. The raising of appropriate emotions at the appropriate time. The third great medical author that we are looking at is CAELIUS Aurelianus, and here we spring to the end of this time span that I have described, the 5th century of our era. Now, CAELIUS Aurelianus' nosological treatise on acute and chronic diseases is a wonderful text that shines especially for the great clinical perceptiveness and the attention to patients that it shows. The observation of patients' manifestations, often in small details. So he's an author, again, we don't know so much about his biography, but we can well think that he was a physician himself from the great amount of details that he preserves. Now, CAELIUS also recommends diversions, reading, and other personalized measures to improve the state of the ill. And just like Celsus, he discusses in depth, first of all, the disease phrenitis that, like I have said, seems to be representative of mental disorder. So first of all, it is important to use the right kind of language with these patients following a kind of allopathic principle. During the whole period of recovery, take measures that the patient may be restored from a condition of mental derangement to a state of sanity. For in most cases, patients remain in a state of sadness, anger, of aberration, right up to the return of physical health. It is necessary, therefore, to use grave and serious language to those whose state had been of hilarity, for thus the weakened condition of their mind and their childish and unrestrained raving are brought under control. But those who are in a state of sadness or anger must be soothed with gentle encouragement and pleasant and cheerful language. For tedium or sadness often has the effect, not only in this but in other diseases, of exciting the malady anew. So they use not only talking to patients, not only the content of words, but also the style, the manner of speaking is important. There is also the right balance about talking and responding to patients. So it is important to oppose them, to kind of incite them to react, but also one should not disagree with them too much. And here he describes the kind of attitude that servants and different attendants should have with mental patients. Do not permit many people, especially strangers, to enter the room, and instruct the servants to correct the patient's aberrations while giving them a sympathetic hearing. So corrections, but also sympathy. That is, have the servants on the one hand avoid the mistake of agreeing with everything the patient says, corroborating all his fantasies, and thus increasing his mania. And on the other hand, have them avoid the mistake of objecting to everything he says, and thus aggravating the severity of the attack. So it is important, again, to find a balance between these two. If the problem of the patient, or if the patient is distressed, especially because of loneliness, use a large number of servants and have them covertly restrain him by massaging his limbs. In this way, they will avoid upsetting him. So there is an interest and an attention to the, again, to the whole social and relational aspect when it comes to the treatment of these patients. The intellectual aspects also play an important role, reading, correcting mistakes, that we have already seen in the case of Celsus. Once the body has gained more strength, one should prescribe walking and vocal exercises as well. Then have the patient read aloud even from texts that are marred by false statements. In this way, he will exercise his mind more thoroughly. And for the same reason, he should also be kept busy answering questions. This will enable us both to detect malingering and to obtain the information we require. It is also a concern that comes very often to the physicians in this time span to detect people who might be pretending to be mad, or all the way around, to be mad but pretending to be sane, which is a typical trick of the mad, as Celsus says. Then let him relax, giving him reading that is easy to understand. And so after the reading, let him see a stage performance. A mime is suitable if the patient's madness has manifested itself in dejection. On the other hand, a composition depicting sadness or tragic terror is suitable in cases of madness which involve playful childishness. So again, this allopathic principle. And finally, the philosophical reading, in particular in cases of mania. And if he is willing to hear discussions of philosophers, he should be afforded the opportunity. For by their words, philosophers have to banish fear, sorrow, and wrath, and in so doing make no small contribution to the health of the body. It is evident from the text that the selection that I've showed you from these three authors, Celsus, Anonymus Parisinus, and CAELIUS Aurelianus, And I have to say other nosological authors of the same time span follow the same tendency. Areteus, for example, that there was no time to show you as well, is a great author that also preserves similar instructions. It is evident from what we have seen that these kind of measures have become part of the stock remedies to calm and balance a disordered mind, in stark contrast with what is found in earlier medicine. The reason for this development can be found, at least in part, in the influence of philosophy onto medical approaches to the health of the soul and the care of the self. These are, however, nosological authors, so they list these aspects without, unfortunately, developing and elaborating too extensively about the practice, the day-by-day routine, possibly, that one has to follow for this kind of therapies. The best source, instead, for details and more depth that we have in this sense, and an extraordinary one, is Galen, the famous physician of the 2nd, 3rd century of our era, who developed in the fullest way on the idea that mental illness, or at least one kind of mental pathology that is restricted to him to a kind of basically ethical flow, can and should be addressed cognitively, philosophically, rather than simply somatically. On several occasions, Galen suggests that psychological states can influence the health of the body in important ways, and describes this as traditional doctrine. This principle has a therapeutical important consequence, of course. In his writing on the matters of health, for instance, he remarks that our ancestral god Asclepius, the god of medicine, prescribed for many patients in emotional distress, to whom the motion of intense passions, having become more intense, had made the mixture of the body warmer than it should, to have odes written for them, as well as to compose mimes and certain kinds of songs. So we are here reminded a bit, I think, in a general sense, of our example from the Odyssey, and also of these exercises, of this use of word as therapeutical practice, both as speaking and hearing, that we have seen already. Most importantly, elsewhere in Galen, we find the design of a true and proper psychotherapeutical project about how to improve one's soul and heal one's ethical flaws and shortcomings. The first example that I'll mention, and surely we will hear more and in more detail tomorrow in Peter Singer's paper, he's the expert about these topics. The first example comes from Galen's treatise, where the affections and errors of the soul are discussed. Galen speaks as a physician, but from an ethical and philosophical standpoint, addressing the improvement of one's soul and character as actual medical project. It is very important to understand this source well, and also it is interesting as a reflection on the history of psychiatry in our tradition, to emphasize that here, when Galen discusses mental disorder in these kind of writings, it is not really talking about mental disorder in the way we understand it, but rather of a moral flow, like I said. Typically, he lists as examples proneness to rage, anger, fear, distress, envy, vehement, strong desire, and similar strong emotions that he condemns on an ethical level. Also, even if, of course, they have, in their extremes, consequences on the health of the body, so they are also physiological phenomena. One of the phases in the treatment that Galen prescribes includes relying on a figure of reference used to improve one's soul through a constant training, a kind of supervisor, as he has been called. Galen suggests that one should choose a reliable friend or acquaintance, a man of virtue and a trustworthy person, and someone who is the kind of person who is free from greed or doesn't have the temptation to become friends of rich and powerful people, so a person you can trust on an ethical point of view as well, and someone who might be available to give you sincere feedback about yourself. This is a figure that can only in part be superimposed to the role that a psychotherapist plays in our conception of it. His main role, in fact, is to provide moral judgment on the behavior of the person, and not really a cure in itself, not any form of sympathy. He plays an instrumental role. Still, it is important to notice that an interlocutory figure is introduced as pivotal in the process. This person is asked to observe the behavior of the person, of Galen in this case, and then report how he behaves under the grip of strong emotions. No? Ask him, he says, to make evident to you directly which of the above-mentioned affections, rage, anger, fear, and so on, he sees in you, emphasizing the gratitude you will feel towards him. He will be your savior, even more so than the man who saves you when you have a body sickness. conversation and exchange with this person are very important, both with the this kind of psychotherapist figure and with one's opponent when we are under the grip of these strong emotions. There is a kind of monitored self-scrutiny going on, and the enactment of criticism and of one's reaction, they become a kind of test of endurance when we are in the grip of strong emotions. First of all, from the very process of contemplating when talking to the supervisor whether his criticism was correct or not, you will be conscious of a great benefit. And if you do this continually on the basis of a genuine choice that you have made to become a decent human being, you will become one. And then in the initial period, even if after diligent investigation you find that a person has accused you insultingly and falsely, do not attempt to persuade yourself that you have committed no error. But let this be the first rudiment to your philosophy, to endure insult. At some later point, when you become conscious that your affections have been sufficiently reduced, you will try to justify yourself against such insult, but never in a shrill or argumentative way, nor displaying a quarrelsome spirit or desire to beat the person. Rather, you will do it for your own benefit, so that when he produces some plausible counter-reply to your rebuttal, too, you will either be persuaded that his assessment is superior, or find, on further examination, that you are free of his accusation. So it is very important to stage one's reactions to the antagonism of others, even when you think that, that you are, and keep them under check, even when you think that you are actually right. So these discussions, it is very clear that are in particular about anger, rage, so this kind of angry reactions to criticism or hostility from others. In another text, on avoiding distress, Galen focuses specifically on another strong emotion that can pathologically affect the mind, lupe, distress or grief, and he talks about this emotion extensively in other writings too. Susan Mattern has written an important article which has a great survey of this emotion in Galen. And he proposes here too a model of therapy or self-training which is based on words and a kind of imagination, the construction of dramatic scenarios that we have already seen, if in a different application, in this kind of psychodramas that the Anonymous and also Celsus prescribed. So the way to help oneself to prepare oneself to adversities by imagining negative possibilities. You are well aware that observations of politics is a good teacher by reminding us the actions of chance, the fact that anything bad can always happen, chance. What Euripides put into the mouth of Theseus somewhere is true above all, as we recognize when you hear. As I once learned from a wise man, I fell to considering disasters constantly, adding for myself exile from my native land, untimely deaths, and other ways of misfortune, so that should I ever suffer any of what I was imagining, it might not gnaw in my soul because it was a novel arrival. The wise man constantly reminds himself of everything that he might possibly suffer, and someone who is not a wise man, provided that he does not live like an animal, is in some way also stimulated to a knowledge of the human condition by the realities of daily life. The wise man again reminds himself in all circumstances of the bad things that could happen. Therefore, I urge you to exercise the imagination of your soul almost in every moment. So what seems to be described in both examples in the set of Galenic texts that I have showed is a kind of cognitive therapy, we could say, where the greatest importance is attached to the talking and social communication, the first, and the projection of one's life and one's reaction to adversities and negative outcomes in the second case. Now, this is not really, or not exactly, a kind of spiritual healing, and as you might perhaps have already noticed, it must involve to some extent high or good reasoning capacities, philosophical attitude, and intellectual refinement, and quite some leisure. It is not for all, but speaks directly to the wealthy, well-educated urban elites, and male, obviously. It has very much been noticed and assessed now, this peculiar social audience that Galen has in these writings. As such, and on these conditions, this Galenic therapy is also limited in its efficacy to what the nature of each allows, as Galen clearly said in several passages of his work. Now, he says that it's never too late to begin trying to improve oneself and trying to become a better human being, even but after the age of 50, he says one can start such a project, but also there are limits to what can be achieved, the limits of the characteristics of one's body. Most explicitly and most extremely, at the end of his treatises on how the dispositions of the soul follow the temperaments of the body, quod animi mores, he states that there are some people that are so bad they cannot be improved by any means. So there is not much that you can do for them. And these people we normally and understandably hate and don't want to be in their company. Appropriately, we hate the wicked among men without considering the reason that makes them so. So the fact that they are so because of the temperaments of their body, so it's not their fault in a sense. And on the contrary, we are attracted to the good ones and love them, regardless of whether they have become such by nature, because of the education they have received, or out of their own choice or customs. And we will and we kill the irremediably bad for 3 good reasons: lest they do any harm if they should live, so that they might instill fear in those similar to them, that they will be punished for the evil doings they will commit, and thirdly, it is better for them to die, since they are so corrupt in their soul that they cannot be educated even by the Muses, nor they can receive any improvement from Socrates or Pythagoras. So there is no philosophy or poetry or any other exercise of the soul or any of the practices that we have quoted that can add anything to their state in their case. So in the case of Galen, and also in the other examples that we have seen so far, the therapy of the words goes in one direction, or mainly in one direction, from the practitioner, or from the philosophical healer, to the patient. For us, however, psychotherapy is especially, or to an important extent, about the opposite traffic, that goes from patient to interlocutor as a fundamental part of the process, especially in the psychoanalytical setting. Ancient medicine has on the whole been judged to score rather poorly in this respect. Attention to the voice of the patient, the voice of the suffering person, seems to be rarely advertised, so that the one text that exposes this inverse traffic, an attention, a very specific attention to this opposite traffic from the ill person to the doctor, deserves to receive emphasis here. And I'm talking about Rufus of Ephesus' Questiones Medicales, medical questions, a text that discusses, theorizes, and teaches precisely the technique of asking patients questions and the importance of this process of inquiry. Now, this text, of course, has to do primarily with a concern with the information patients can offer. So Rufus's point is really that there are aspects of an illness that cannot be divined simply by observation, palpation, or by using the senses of the physician, and need to come through the subjectivity of the patient. He's talking about diseases in general, but this switch of viewpoint, or the incorporation of the viewpoint of the patient in such an explicit way, is an important move and something radically different from what we find in most other texts up to that moment. Also, this text has a value in itself for its own importance in a psychological perspective, because it emphasizes the importance of questioning and the use of question and answer, specifically in the case of mental health issues. He writes, "This is my first principles. Put your inquiries to the patient himself. From his source, you can learn the extent of the person's mental sickness or health." So this is the first domain of a patient's state that cannot be accessed in any other way than through questioning, as well as his physical strength and weakness, and at the same time, the type and location of the sickness. If he answers coherently, appropriately, and with good recall, without stumbling, either vocally or mentally, and in a way that corresponds to his own natural inclination, mildly and moderately, if he's otherwise in character moderate, or again boldly, if he's naturally bold, or fearfully, if he's naturally timid, then you should regard his mind at any rate as being in good order. But if you ask one question and he answers another, if in the middle of speaking he forgets what he is saying, if his speech is tremulous and unclear, and there are shifts from the original mood to the opposite, all these are associated with derangement, which means a severe illness altogether. A good physician is the physician who can interpret the manner of talking of a patient and read it psychologically and also frame it within the more general physiological state of health. You can comprehend the patient's physical strength from how he tells you what has happened, not only from what he says. For the melancholy state is clearly indicated by an over-boldness and uncalled-for sadness, both of which are particularly evident in the things the patient says. They are evident in other ways too, but the addition of this empirical test will allow you the sickness to be clearly recognized. While an imminent case of lethargy is obvious if, when responding to questions, the patient forgets what he's saying and speaks without clarity, and so on. Now, it is very interesting that in Galen, most evidently, to go back to the general picture that I'm trying to draw here, in Galen, most evidently, and if you go back to the passage about those patients that are so seriously depraved in their mind that they cannot be saved and are better off dead, but also implicitly in also the other authors that we have seen from CAELIUS onwards, as they speak of mental health, there is a moral coloring, an evaluation of the insane that emerges and becomes very important in the first centuries of our era and can be observed in the discussions of mental disorders very consistently in these authors in this time period. Mad equals to some extent bad, morally defective, that must be antagonized by the physician. And ethical flaws and bad behaviors are variously cast out as pathology. Of course, there are degrees to this, depending on one disease, from one disease to the other, but this is a kind of outlook that was entirely absent from the earlier medicine. This kind of trajectory goes parallel to the development of a therapy of the word or forms of psychotherapy, so this kind of or more comprehensive therapeutical measures that I have described. Value judgment on the patient, the ethical scrutiny of his or her actions and thoughts are, it seems, the price to pay attached to the development of these methods. A therapy addressing personality, emotions, character by means of talk and activities appears to be inseparable from evaluation. I will conclude with the last and most explicit example to illustrate this. This is CAELIUS Aurelianus again, who discusses a disease, that of the MALTHACOE, or passive homosexuals, that is extraordinary in many senses, and a major example of a moralized conceptualization of what is a mental disease. So I just read it first of all. So the pathics, or MALTHACOE, passive homosexuals, like the Euripides, who are the female versions of these patients, are victims of an affliction of the mind. And this is a very loaded claim for CAELIUS Aurelianus, because elsewhere he distinguishes mental diseases that are actually from the body, so they affect the body, they affect the mind as a consequence, but they are rooted in the physiology, so they can be addressed psychotherapeutically, but also through the physiology. These are really a responsibility of the person. They are affliction of the mind, for there exists no bodily treatment which can be applied to overcome the disease. It is rather the mind that is affected in these disgraceful vices, and his language is strongly ethical here and elsewhere in this chapter. And is consequently the mind that must be controlled, for no man has ever overcome bodily lust by playing the woman's sexual role or gained relief by contact with the penis. In general, the relief of pain and disease is achieved by other means. So there is no way of agreeing with them or try to cure their body, but there are other means that have to be resorted to in this case. And he doesn't really even explain what these other means should be, but we can imagine of the coercive type, some kind of violent or constraining measure. So the disease of the soul, perhaps the only clear disease of the soul, par excellence, that is found in this author, is first and foremost described as a disgusting ethical deviation, something that is unbelievable and, incredible, impossible to accept or to cure. In conclusion, the history of ancient Greco-Roman medicine shows that, at least in this tradition, the incorporation of personality and psychology in this sense of psychotherapy within the cure, the healing of mental disorders, comes parallel to the incorporation of another soft element, that of value and normativity. On the one hand, this humanism in therapy is a positive progress, attention to the individual, non-invasive measures, soothing, agreeing, diverting, socializing, giving responsibility to the patient in the first person. But it opens, on the other hand, the door to normative and to a normative ideology in psychiatry. The separation of talking therapies from prejudice, judgment, and ideology remains today perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of a psychotherapist profession. And this is a topic on which many of you in the audience have much more to say than I can. Thank you very much.